Iran's leader Ayatollah Khamenei has spoken for the first time after the recent riots that broke out in Iran. He was very clear about one thing: the violent riots in Iran were planned by the US and the Zionist regime in reference to Israel. In the capacity of the Iranian armed forces, the leader was surprised how many had not observed the rioting to have its origins stemming from plots hashed by the US and Israel. Well, in this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at the statements of Iran's leader and dissect what he has described as one of the main motivations of the US and Israel, which is to prevent a strong and independent Iran, including the country's progress. Our guests joining us for this edition of The Spotlight are Kevin Barrett, editor at Veterans Today, who joins us from Madison. Also joining us is Brent Yonkers, historian and journalist, who joins us from Hasselt from Belgium. Okay, welcome to you both. Let me first start with you, Kevin Barrett, if I may. We're looking at Iran's leader to have made a statement and blaming the US and Israel in terms of the deadly riots, which he said were orchestrated and engineered in advance by both. What is your reading into what Iran's leader has said there?
Well, I think he's telling the truth, and he probably could have said it earlier based on means, motive, opportunity, and I would presume intelligence reports, but maybe he was waiting a little bit just to be sure. In any case, it is thunderingly obvious that this kind of activity in Iran and in so many other countries around the world that are trying to be independent sovereign nations rather than vassal states of the US empire are being subverted with these kinds of activities. And I do assume that the leader has access to very detailed and accurate reports about what's been going on. But even without those, just from a big picture analysis, in the same way that we know who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline based on who tried to stop it from being built, who threatened to blow it up if a war in Ukraine should break out, who controls that part of the Baltic, and so on. We know that was the US empire and its NATO military infrastructure. And likewise, based on the historical record in which the United States military and CIA has murdered about 60 million people. Well, this was actually before the 9/11 war, so it's now up to pushing towards 100 million people in interventions since World War II, many of which involve destabilizing countries by fomenting chaos and then moving in. And in the old days, they used to take over the country. Now they just destroy it and turn it into an anarchic wasteland, as they've done to Libya, and they certainly destroyed Syria, although it seems to be bouncing back. So we know from historical patterns that this had to be part of this U.S. destabilization operation process that's been going on for so long. And we know that they orchestrated the attempted color revolution about, 12, 14 years ago, that so-called Green Revolution, and they orchestrate all the color revolutions. So sure. I think the Supreme Leader, in a sense, is belaboring the obvious, but it's great that he's willing to say this, because it's interesting how, as the U.S. commits these crimes all over the world, how few leaders are willing to stand up and talk about it. Everybody knows the U.S. just blew up the Nord Stream pipeline and that Europe is going to starve and freeze this winter because of the United States and its declaration of war against the European Union. But all of the leaders in Europe are afraid to say that. So it's good that we have at least one leader in the world courageous enough to state these simple and obvious truths.
Well, Brent Yonkers, based on what our guest, Kevin Barrett, said, these are things that should be acknowledged and should be brought into the conversation, and in this case, when Iran is the topic. Now, the color revolutions on the one hand, destabilization activities on the other, that the U.S. is guilty of. It's all out there. We could talk about it, but we need a few programs to talk about it, at a minimum. But what's interesting is what a former CIA official by the name of Bruce Riddell said once. He said, for years, the U.S. has been acting against Iran, and I'm going to quote him, "There's little doubt that there is a covert war underway against Iran. There are at least two players in it, the United States and Israel." So that kind of gives credence to what Iran's leader has said, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. There are numerous ways for us to know, including indeed the admissions of CIA agents or former CIA agents and American agents in general, But also, if we just look at the facts, the way they are, all of this campaign and the dozens of people that have been killed in the violence that has ensued following the death of Mahsa Amini in the police custody, and the quote-unquote cause of this instability. When you see all the things that have taken place in such a short time, you'd have to be deluded to believe that this all is a spontaneous response to the death of one woman who we know for a fact was not murdered by police. The CCTV footage is there, the video footage is there. We know she collapsed in the police station. So we know she was not touched by anyone anywhere around the time when she died. So we know that she was not killed by the police. This video footage was definitely not part of the plan of the imperialist plot when they tried to pin this on the quote-unquote morality of the police and say that she was quote-unquote murdered by the police. But what this death in and of itself was just the little spark that they needed. But we can say with absolute certainty that the violence and the instability and the terrorism that has been going on against Iran in the past weeks was pre-planned. There is no way that suddenly the death of one woman, that suddenly is the actual cause that causes Kurdish separatists, terrorists in the north of Iran to start killing people, to start committing terrorist attacks by in Balochistan, near Zahedan, by Baloch separatists and Takfiri terrorists who are active there. International protests, international manifestations trying to foment the ethnic strife in Iran and trying to break Iran apart on ethnic lines. I have seen people talk, calling for the Kurds to tear away from Iran, for the Azeris to tear away from Iran, for the Balochs to tear away from Iran. This is all pre-planned. This is all preordained already months ago. There is no way that this is a organic revolution, and it is not a revolution. It is a plan that is put into motion every so often. It's only been a couple of years ago that there was a previous round of such fomented attacks against Iran. This happens every couple of years because the plan is, the American plan is that they want to keep trying to destabilize, and the Zionist plan as well, to destabilize Iran more
That's
and more.
a good point.
Every week, try something new, hoping that it would work, and every few years they are defeated again by the forces of the Islamic Republic.
So that's a good point that he makes there, Kevin Barrett, if we can add to that, because we're not looking at just, for example, the protests that are happening in Tehran or in many cities perhaps across the country, but we're looking at different elements that either have used the protests to ignite themselves into pre-planned execution of instability and insecurity and violence, where they're sitting back waiting for a reason to come out. Of course, in northwest Iran, the Kurds, as our guest there from Hasselt mentioned. How do you see the fact that there are different actors, destabilizing actors, waiting for opportunities to create havoc inside the Islamic Republic?
Yes, I think it's obviously centrally coordinated, as he said, and that was a very good summary, by the way. It's interesting that these protests, which are supposedly around this police brutality and hijab issue, which of course, as it turns out, as we heard, the CCTV footage shows that it was not the George Floyd situation where the person was directly killed. So it's now breaking out as ethnic separatism. What does ethnic separatism have to do with this issue? Well, what it has to do with is that the CIA, which of course has been running a covert war on Iran alongside the Israeli Mossad, which has been murdering Iranian scientists. 17,000 Iranian civilians have been killed by these terrorists, mostly these MEK terrorists backed by the West now, after they were taken off the terrorist list a decade ago. And of course, many of those murders happened before that as well. So the central organization of an attempt to break up Iran along the lines of the Oded Yinon plan to balkanize the region in service to Israel is apparently underway. And both the Zionists and the American empire have a geostrategic interest in pursuing this course. The Zionists have a much stronger one because the Islamic Republic of Iran has been the most principled opponent of Zionism and the strongest supporter of the Palestinians. And of course, that's the biggest reason why the American empire, which is largely controlled by Zionists, has insisted on going to war, even if covert war, against the Islamic Republic since its very beginning. And the American geostrategic interest here really should be to work with the Islamic Republic. There's no reason why the U.S. needs regime change in Tehran, but the policy is dictated by the Zionists, who need endless U.S. hostility to the region. So they have this coordinated effort to destabilize the country, working with paid ethnic separatist elements and such. And so as soon as there was any excuse, they flipped the switch and set off these riots, which again have everything to do with a destabilization attempt and really nothing to do with the ostensible issue.
Well, this is an interesting statement coming from Iran's leader, where Brett Yonkers, he said, and I'm going to quote him, "The enemies do not want such progress to happen in the country," in reference to progress that Iran's leader mentioned happening in all sectors, which would facilitate domestic production, as he said, activation of knowledge-based companies. And he said that they want, the plot was to close universities to stop that progress, to create insecurity on the streets, and to engage in state officials with new issues. For example, as you mentioned, in northwestern and southeastern parts of the country. This is interesting because we're looking perhaps not just the JCPOA revival talks from coming into fruition, or maybe not, but really the shift that's happening. It's a geostrategic tectonic shift of Iran forces joining with Russia, China, moving towards the east, and really having this economic shift happening overall, where Iran's progress would be part of that, given the fact that this 13th administration has been so gung-ho with joining different organizations and trade blocs minus the US or the West. How much validity do you see in that statement coming from Iran's leader?
I think that is an absolutely key issue to understand when you want to ask, and when you want to answer the question, why now? Why must this happen now? And the reason for that is that just a couple of weeks ago, we saw what is possibly the most pivotal international geopolitical meeting that we have ever seen in our lifetime, or at least in my lifetime, which is the 22nd summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. This was almost completely uncovered in Western media. They just didn't talk about it, but you can be absolutely sure that in the actual halls of power in the West, there was a gigantic fear about this happening, because the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is the biggest geopolitical bloc in the world. There is no economic or political power in terms of GDP, in terms of population, that and in terms of military prowess even, that is stronger than the SCO. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is not a mutual defense pact as such, but it is a pact of close mutual cooperation and in some ways also self-defense. They will cooperate against terrorism, they will cooperate against regime change operations across their own sectarian and religious and political lines from a perspective of non-interference and anti-imperialism. And now, of course, the Samarkand summit saw the official admission, or at least approval of the admission of the Islamic Republic of Iran into this bloc, which means we are talking about a geopolitical unit that counts Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and now Iran, as well as other member states, as its members. This is an incredibly powerful template to use for future, for the future. And it is basically a part of the rise of Eurasia, the rise of the East, and the new Silk Roads, like have been the things that have been talked about in Russia and in Beijing for years, but it's now really coming forward. And when you see that Iran, which is such an important player in this, in the ancient Silk Roads, and then also in the possibility for the new Silk Roads and for the let's say the integration of the political sphere of Eurasia, when Iran joins this is a gigantic slap in the face for the American empire and for the Zionists. And this is most likely the most important reason why they had to grab anything they could grab their hands on, in this case the tragic death of a woman in police custody. Grab this in order to try to foment strife and try to potentially overthrow the Islamic Republic before the official admission of Iran into the SCO.
Thank you for that. I do have to ask you about this, Kevin Barrett, because it was very interesting how during the course of these riots, there were 9 European nationals that were arrested during these protests, in which the nationalities were from Germany, Poland, Italy, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, to name a few. But what's interesting, aside from that, is the fact that back on May 11th of this year, Iran's intelligence ministry said that it had arrested 2 European nationals, and upon questioning said that they had orchestrated a plot to foment chaos, social disorder, and insecurity across the country. This shows the depth, I'm looking at it, the depth of how the different countries, European countries, are involved here in this case in point, and how widespread of a plan they had, an in-depth plan they had to go ahead with the social disorder that they wanted to create. What is your reading into how far in advance they had planned this?
Oh, I'm sure that there are contingency plans for things like this that are sitting around on the shelf pretty much all the time. And then they're dusted off and set into motion when the circumstances seem right to the perpetrators. And it's interesting, as you said, that these Europeans are involved. I'm sure the reason for that is that the US empire has quite a large degree of control over Europe, although it may not much longer if the Europeans wake up and notice who cut off their jugular vein and their energy supplies this winter. But for now, Europe remains fully American occupied, and the NATO people, the CIA and special forces people can work with Europeans, and those Europeans can become proxies, and then they can go into Iran and try and create this kind of havoc. It's easier for them to do it that way because I believe the Iranian services are more wary of U.S. Americans coming into Iran. I've visited Iran many times and was welcomed warmly by everybody, but I know that it's harder for ordinary Americans to do it. So they're probably working through their European vassals. And I think we also should pay attention to the Supreme Leader's statement about progress, that they don't like progress. And I think he's right. The ideology of progress in the West is that everybody has to become neoliberal and decadent, and religion has to be eliminated.
Sure.
That's their version of progress. But the Supreme Leader's version of progress, which is also the version in Moscow and Beijing, is progress means trade between sovereign, equal nation states based in their own respective countries' traditions. Fully sovereign states, not owned by a U.S.-based neoliberal empire. And that, I believe, is true progress, and that is what they are afraid of. So I think the Supreme Leader was absolutely right about that.
Okay. This news came out not right before, but it came out an hour or so before this broadcast and this program, Brett Yonkers, and that is how Canada has imposed fresh sanctions on Iran for, even the news when it came out, the way it was worded was for alleged human rights violations, which included the death of Mahsa Amini, as The Wire read. And what's interesting about this is that it actually came out and also imposed sanctions on Iran's Press TV. I'm not too sure how Press TV, in that case in point, will be included at the top of their list when you have media organizations like the BBC and Iran International, who are clearly encouraging people to come and riot, to come out and incite violence, because they show those images next to "please come out and protest." I mean, they even said, if you're on a wheelchair, don't stay at home, come out and protest. Anyways, my question is, isn't Canada accused of human rights violations itself when it was discovered that hundreds, if not thousands, of indigenous children were buried in mass graves, unmarked mass graves?
Yes, absolutely. And Canada is a country with an extremely bloody history in and of itself. And we're not indeed, with these residential schools, we're not talking about things that happened in the times of the Wild West or the colonization of the Americas. These are things that happened up until the 1950s and even 1960s. So we're talking about things that happened quite recently when we're talking from a historical perspective. And even if you want to do this more recently, Canada is one of the major suppliers of weaponry to countries such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for use against the people of Yemen, which is one of the most, or at this point, the most destructive conflict in the world. Canada, of course, plays a huge role through its significant Ukrainian diaspora, which has a significant neo-Nazi direction to it, plays a role also in supporting the Euromaidan neo-Nazi government in Kiev in their conflict against the people of the Donbass. So this is really not a country that has much right to say anything, and they should probably, be quiet and fix their own problems first. But yeah, this is news to me too. The fact that they find new sanctions, what they always find fascinating is how these people figure out to find even more sanctions than what they already did. I'm pretty sure the Canadian economical cooperation with the Islamic Republic of Iran is already quite negligible. So what they still find in order to sanction more, it's absolutely fascinating. I think they always keep a little bit more in the bag just to be able to do more sanctions later, just so that they have the idea that they're doing something useful.
Kevin Barrett, my final question to you is, don't you think that countries should wake up who are allied with the U.S.? And the only the union that I could think of at this point, composed of the 27-member bloc, is the European Union, for example, of which the U.S. is leading them down an economic path of economic disaster, where it's basically almost leading to divisions within the EU, almost having these countries come back to the U.S. or to reinvest in the U.S., relocate their factories, that one of these days the U.S. would turn against them. Because the U.S. has a track record, as both you and our other guests have mentioned, color revolutions, etc. Aren't other countries afraid that the U.S. would turn their back against it based on the history that it has established?
Well, yes, of course. Henry Kissinger famously said that it's dangerous to be an enemy of the U.S., but to be a friend is often fatal. And the Europeans are learning that the hard way right now. We're seeing a massive historical shift here where the U.S. is no longer even pretending to take a win-win kind of approach to its dealings with its European vassals. They have gotten the consent of the Europeans to militarily occupy Europe and essentially totally call the shots and dominate Europe now for many, many decades. But that was all under the pretense that it was a win-win situation. Europe wouldn't have to spend very much money on their militaries. They could let the U.S. worry about military affairs. Well, that period may be over now. So we're coming to a real crisis in this clash of geopolitical paradigms, the U.S. neoliberal empire attempting to crush all opposition and take over the entire world versus the resistance.
Thank you, Kevin Barrett, editor at Veterans Today from Madison. Brett Yonkers, thank you, historian and journalist from Hasselt, Belgium. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight from Mikava Tahwei. It's goodbye.